feature on. And with that, I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, William Matchin. William is currently as an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, and we'll talk today about grammatical parallelism in aphasia. William, thank you so much for being here today. We're so much looking forward to your talk. And so now everyone, please welcome William.
Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen and see if that works appropriately. Okay, is the PowerPoint visible?
Yeah.
Okay, and still appropriately visible?
Now it's the presenter mode.
Ah, okay, yes. Let's see if I...
Yeah, now it's perfect for us at least.
Okay, I may have to look away from the camera while giving this lecture because it's now on the other side of the screen, but that will be not a problem. Okay, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be speaking with you and to be taking part in this symposium. Obviously, I have the tremendous admiration for all the work that's been done in this laboratory over the years, and it's influenced my work quite heavily. And I also greatly appreciate the focus of the symposium on the junior researchers and trying to highlight their work and to engage them actively in the ongoing research activities. So it was funny because before the talk started, I was chatting with Emiliano Zaccarella. One thing he mentioned is the younger researchers, they tend to have this view that there's a lot of new fancy methods, a lot of sophisticated analyses, but they can be often dissatisfied at the lack of an underlying theory or a robust sort of theoretical infrastructure to support that work. You know, how do you proceed? Fancy methods are very great, but if you don't have a strong theoretical underlying structure there, it may be difficult to make progress. So I don't tend to like to start talks with this kind of cheesy metaphor or reference, but I was just recently watching the James Bond movie Skyfall, and in the movie, James Bond is a little bit, not quite over the hill, but slow a bit and losing some of his luster. And there's a couple scenes in the movie where this line, sometimes the old ways are the best, comes up, when using a straight razor to shave himself, and sort of a sultry encounter, the woman says, well, sometimes the old way is the best. Or when defending themselves against a more powerful attacker, they find themselves without very many weapons, but they have, a couple old rifles and knives. And again, sometimes the old ways are the best. So today I'll be talking about some of the old ways with respect to neuropsychology and the neurobiology of language, in particular the study of aphasia and the patterns of lesions that are associated, in particular in stroke, that cause language deficits that we see in a variety of different types of aphasic disorders. So that'll be the focus of my talk. Of course, most of my research in the past is focused on functional neuroimaging, and I know that many of you use that methodology, but today I'll be focusing mostly on the aphasia work. So I'm sure that most of you are familiar with what's called the classical model. So this was initially created by Karl Wernicke and his co-author Lichtheim, and then later Geschwind in the United States. And the model is based on a simple set of observations regarding different patterns of language deficits that were seen in aphasia. So for example, the classic dichotomy between fluent aphasia, patients that have voluminous speech output but poor comprehension, and non-fluent aphasia, patients that tend to have impaired production but often preserved comprehension. And so the idea was, well, we could derive a theoretical model about the function of the various areas that tend to be implicated in these different aphasic subtypes. And so the idea, according to this model, is that Broca's area was a key area in terms of encoding the articulatory speech memories. And so they didn't have the sophisticated linguistic terminology that we have today, but we can think of this something like an articulatory phonology. And then likewise, Wernicke's area in the posterior temporal lobe was thought to hold these auditory speech memories. Again, something like an auditory phonology, not the basic acoustic or motor processes, but some higher level linguistic representations. So if you damage the Wernicke's area, then you would have a deficit in comprehension, but you might still see plenty of fluent production because Broca's area would be intact that had those representations, and then vice versa. So it was a sophisticated model that actually predicted the existence of aphasia subtypes that hadn't yet been discovered, and was productive for some time. Now, today, I'll be basically using this same approach, this lesion deficit correlation approach, looking at patterns of brain damage and the associated linguistic deficits to inform us about the neurobiological architecture of language in the brain. So using updated methods, the logic is still the same. We're looking for patterns of brain damage and associating those with deficits. But now we can do a more complicated statistical approach. So we have a number of subjects. So some of the studies I'll be talking about today have more than 200 subjects in them, and their lesions are mapped, hand-drawn onto anatomical MRIs, and then warped to a standard template. And so then we can perform statistical maps, essentially just correlating locations of deficits with changes in the behavioral profiles of the subject, right? So this is pretty analogous to what you might do in functional MRI, except there's no time series data, but we're correlating different patterns across the subjects with differences in their behavioral scores. So the classical model, a lot of progress was made, is informative, but of course it wasn't very linguistically sophisticated. And in the middle of the 20th century, as I'm sure many of you are aware, people like Noam Chomsky proposed these more sophisticated analyses of language behavior. And in particular, Chomsky's work incorporated this notion that language involves the infinite use of finite means. It would not be very interesting if it was the finite use of infinite means, although that would also be interesting. The quote from von Humboldt, of course. And so his theories basically accounted for the fact that languages have these hierarchical structures, lexical elements that are associated with syntactic categories and combined into these hierarchical phrases. And the structure of the language determines or relates directly to the interpretation. So it's a very important aspect for interpretation of sentence meaning. And if you look cross-linguistically, you see some variability, for example, in terms of orthography, phonology, different kinds of morphological expressions, but you see basically the same kinds of hierarchical structures which relate to semantics in the same way. So very interesting properties of the human species. And so the model, this is one version of Chomsky's theories of generative grammar, is that there's a sort of syntactic structure building component. Perhaps some complexity within that, different modules. Now we talk about a single component merge with some appropriated principles to constrain the generation of syntactic structure, and that being interpreted in two ways, in terms of phonetic form, or the sensory motor exponents of the expression, and logical form being the meaning, the interpretation of meaning given the structure. So this is a big update to what we know about language from the 1800s, right? In the 1800s, we had this kind of folk linguistic theory of articulatory speech memories and auditory word memories, etc. So the question is now, how do we incorporate this into models of language in the brain? So one hint is that in non-fluent Broca's aphasia, which is a very common aphasia subtype, there's a common symptomology called agrammatism, and be using the term expressive agrammatism to talk about the disorder to speech production, right? This is the overall tendency to omit functional words and morphemes, things like articles, inflectional morphology, often prepositions, depending on the type, with this telegraphic speech or simplified sentence structure. So for example here, this is a patient with Broca's aphasia, Carl. He was actually in this movie, Aphasia the movie, which I recommend watching. He's a person that actually had aphasia or has aphasia currently, but starred in the movie and was very clear in describing his own experience of the syndrome. So he says something like small words, no pictures, but cat, okay, cat, fine, which I think pretty clearly sums up his the nature of his agrammatic speech. And if we look at modern lesion symptom mapping methods of expressive agrammatism, what we find is a pretty robust relationship with damage to the frontal lobe, in particular the inferior and middle frontal gyri and expressive agrammatic deficits. And this has been looked at in a variety of ways: in stroke-based aphasia, in primary progressive aphasia, which is a neurodegenerative disorder whereby there's not a particular event like a stroke or traumatic brain injury, rather there's a progressive dementia that affects language areas. And both of these methods and populations basically converge on an association of frontal damage, often including the posterior IFG with agrammatic speech deficits. Right, so this I think suggests to some extent that perhaps these ideas that Chomsky was talking about in terms of hierarchical syntax and sentence structure there's something about Broca's area and its environs that may be encoding this property. And critically, in the 1970s, there was I would say, an extremely influential experiment, and a series of other experiments as well, performed by Alfonso Karamazza and Edgar Zuref. In particular, this one published in 1976. So it was well known that expressive agrammatism was associated with non-fluent Broca's aphasia, damage to the frontal lobe, but it was always assumed that comprehension abilities were essentially intact. And according to the theory of generative grammar, the syntactic mechanism is supposed to be a central syntactic system that underlies our use of language, and it should be affecting both of those domains. It would be kind of strange if you have a generative grammar for production, but it doesn't hold in comprehension, for example. So they sort of had some sense that perhaps this classic assumption that the comprehension deficits were intact, or there were no comprehension deficits in Broca's aphasia, might not be correct. So they basically did an experiment to try to test this. So I'll describe that here. They had a variety of different sentence types, and this is in English. We've got English sentences with an embedded relative clause. So for example, the girl is kicking a green ball. And the idea is that this sentence doesn't necessarily require the computation of a hierarchical syntactic structure in order to comprehend it. Because if you get the individual lexical items, you can rely on heuristics, for example, the plausible thematic relations among the entities of the sentence. So girls kick balls and not the other way around. Likewise, sentences, right. So the idea was that you could understand some of these sentences without having to rely on syntax, but that other sentences you would. So for example, this third type here, the man the woman is hugging is happy. So here now we have a non-canonical word order. It's an object relative sentence, right? So the man is the object of hugging, and it's semantically reversible. So there's no bias in terms of the interpretation of whether the man and the woman should be hugging each other. So you can't appeal to world knowledge and these plausibility heuristics. So the idea was that if you look at those kinds of sentences relative to the ones with the semantic and word order heuristics available to them, then you should see a deficit if somebody had perhaps, let's say, a selective deficit in comprehending the syntactic structure of a sentence. What do they find? People with Broca's aphasia tend to show this pattern: good performance on the canonical sentences with semantic constraints, and poor performance on those that are semantically reversible with non-canonical word order. Right, so their conclusion from this was, well, the present data suggests that, at least for Broca's aphasics, the brain damage affects the general language processing mechanism that subserves the syntactic component of both comprehension and production. The implication that follows is that the anterior language area of the brain, Broca's area, is necessary for syntactic-like cognitive operations. I'm not sure why we have to say syntactic-like. You could just say syntactic. And this is a very influential study. So I'm just quoting from some prominent authors. So Peter Hagwort, for example, quotes this study and says lesions in Broca's area are known to impair not only language production, but also comprehension. And again, this is thought to be more specific to syntax. And quoting Dr. Friederici, this observation led to the view that Broca's area subserves grammatical processes during both production and comprehension. That's the conclusion of Karamazza and Zuref. So following this, there came to be a strong association between hierarchical syntactic processing and Broca's area in terms of its function, in terms of deficits in aphasia, in terms of functional neuroimaging experiments. For example, this one, which is done by Emiliano Zaccarella. And so this is a very, I would say, influential and a commonly espoused view in the literature. There's a variety of problems, though, with the concept that damage to Broca's area causes overarching agrammatism. The overarching agrammatism, the idea that there's a syntactic deficit in both production and comprehension in these patients. So one is that Broca's area damage is not necessarily the cause of Broca's aphasia. It's commonly implicated. In fact, it's the region that most commonly is associated with Broca's aphasia. But there are plenty of patients with damage to Broca's area that don't have Broca's aphasia, and cases of Broca's aphasia without damage to Broca's area. So for example, the original study by Karamazza and Zuref, it wasn't clear the location of their lesions. We knew that they had Broca's aphasia, but we didn't know exactly where their lesions might be. Another factor is that people with Broca's aphasia tend to have large lesions that impinge on the temporal lobe. Actually kind of show this here. So this is a lesion symptom mapping study done by my colleague Julius Friedrichsen. And what they do is they look at patients with damage to Broca's area, some of whom have Broca's aphasia, and some of them who do not have Broca's aphasia. And what they find that the difference between those that end up with Broca's aphasia is that they have damage to the temporal lobe, right? In particular, posterior temporal lobe. So the syndrome is much more complex. It may involve other areas, including the posterior temporal lobe, which was never assumed to be the case in previous research on syntactic comprehension and Broca's aphasia. There's a variety of other pieces of evidence that are relevant here. What I'm going to focus on here are the last two observations, demonstrations of relatively intact syntactic competence in agrammatic Broca's aphasia, and the fact that we do see syntactic comprehension deficits in other aphasia subtypes. So if I actually go back to Karamazov and Zurev's original study, everyone focuses on the conclusion that Broca's aphasia showed the expected pattern of worse performance on semantically unconstrained non-canonical sentences. But if you look, that B means Broca, right? W is Wernicke, their pattern was a bit inscrutable in this study. But the conduction aphasia patients, these are people with fluent aphasia, typically good comprehension, well, typically poor comprehension, actually. Conduction aphasia is a complicated syndrome. The main deficit in conduction aphasia is repetition, but it turns out that they showed essentially the same asyntactic comprehension deficits as Broca's aphasia, right? It's not selective to Broca's aphasia, this pattern. So as another example of this, there was an interesting study by Friederici and Gretz, 1987, looking at people with Wernicke's aphasia and Broca's aphasia, doing a similar kind of assessment, looking at patient or agent first sentences. And I believe the patient first is the non-canonical structure. And so essentially what you would expect for an asyntactic or agrammatic comprehension deficit would be worse performance on patient first than agent first. But if you look at the two groups of Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia, what you see for the Broca's aphasia patient is basically not too much of a difference between them. There's probably a slight effect here of worse performance on the patient first sentences. But you see a dramatic effect in Wernicke's aphasia, which suggests that actually it's kind of the opposite of Karamazov and Zurev's idea, right? It seems like the people with fluent aphasia, in particular Wernicke's aphasia in this case, were the ones that showed the asyntactic profile, whereas Broca's aphasia did not seem to show that profile. Similarly, this is a paper published by Harold Goodglass and colleagues in 1993, looking at agrammatic Broca's aphasia and paragrammatic conduction aphasics. I'll explain Paragramatism in a couple minutes here. But the conclusion from this study was that obviously the Broca's aphasia patients were severely agrammatic in their output, and the conduction aphasia patients were not. But the two groups did not differ in their performance on a battery of morphosyntactic comprehension, right? Suggests that there's an independence between the agrammatic production and the asyntactic comprehension profile, that those aren't necessarily aligned conceptually. And the last piece in the literature that I'll discuss here is just looking at acceptability judgments. So this is an interesting study done by Leinbarger and colleagues, where they looked at 4 patients with Broca's aphasia, agrammatic speech, and they tended to even show this sort of asyntactic comprehension profile where they performed worse on the non-canonical sentences. But they just straight up asked them, if we give them the kinds of sentences that syntacticians use to develop syntactic theory, right, how do they perform on those sentences? So they had a variety of different conditions. I don't have time to discuss them all, but they're interesting in the sense that they kind of cover a lot of different domains of linguistic theory. And what they found essentially is that the 4 patients were close to ceiling on most of the constructions, except for 3 of them: subject copying, reflexives, and ox copying, and those involve long distance dependencies, which are known to involve working memory burdens. And so suggests that their deficits might be due really to working memory, but not to a core deficit in syntactic competence. So for all of these observations and reasons, Greg Hickok and I developed this model published in this paper in cerebral cortex, where basically what we do, and our work was inspired by this recent book by Robert Berwick and Noam Chomsky in 2016, called Why Only Us. I really like this book. There's some technical flaws in terms of just some minor typographic things that are incorrect, but in other ways, it's, I think, a very wonderful book. Everyone hates it. And this is common these days to dismiss the work of Chomsky, but I found it to be quite thorough and intriguing. But what they suggest here is that, well, really with syntax, what they're focusing on is the hierarchical aspect of that is independent of order. So independent of things like word order, affixation, etc. And that there's those other elements that we commonly attribute to syntax, things like word order, etc., that have to do with order, that's actually part of externalization. That's really not part of the core syntax that is relevant for semantic interpretation. So we developed a model by which these two things were separated out. And the area in green, we posited underlies the hierarchical structure of language, independent of word order and other aspects of linearization. Whereas Broca's area, which of course is associated with expressive agrammatism, there's plenty of functional neuroimaging studies associating this region with syntactic processing, that this is really involved in the externalization process, the linearization of a hierarchical structure into a sequence of morphological elements that is necessary for production. And then there's a sort of cascade by which lower levels of the motor hierarchy will implement more fine-grained aspects of linearization, right? So there could be phonological linearization, phonetic, finally down to the motor level at motor cortex. Okay. So one thing that's important, though, is that we do want to establish, using modern lesion symptom mapping methods, an association between syntactic comprehension deficits with respect to the hierarchical structure that's necessary for determining meaning and damage to this area, this posterior area, right? What's the evidence that definitively shows that these kinds of deficits are associated with damage to this region, or at least that vicinity? So we've looked at this a variety of ways. I'm going to review a few studies, so I hope you bear with me. We've got a variety of different kinds of methods. So the first study that I'll be reviewing, we looked at the traditional measure of agrammatic comprehension, which is worst performance on the non-canonical structures relative to canonical ones. Okay, so what we did for this study is we had a battery of sentence comprehension tests, which include passives, object WH questions, and either object relatives or object clefs, depending on the subject, which are very similar kinds of structures. And we looked at performance on those sentences. Again, they're semantically reversible, right? So supposedly taxing syntactic processing resources. And then we include simple active sentences as a covariate. And so that we would hope remove variance due to simple identification of lexical items and access to concepts, and performing a task and selecting the picture that corresponds to that. And for our measure of expressive agrammatism, which we were also interested in looking at, we have simply categorical perceptual ratings of agrammatism. So basically we had a variety of experts look at the samples of speech from these subjects and assess whether they're agrammatic or not. So to make a long story short, when we perform our lesion symptom mapping analyses of the syntactic comprehension measure, again, performance on non-canonical sentences with performance on active sentences as a covariate. And this is an unthresholded statistical map. We have an ROI analysis that is corrected for multiple comparisons, but I just wanted to show you basically in the brain, any positive associations with this measure were all in the temporal lobe, and primarily the posterior temporal lobe, right? Whereas expressive agrammatism, this confirms a lot of previous research. The strongest effect is in the inferior middle frontal cortex, right? And then we actually show a double dissociation here. So on the left, this is in orange is damage to this posterior middle temporal gyrus region, and in black is damage to the posterior IFG, roughly the pars opercularis. And what we show basically is that for syntactic comprehension, there's this strong statistical association with worse performance, more damage. And then we see there's effectively a none or an effect in the opposite direction for damage to the IFG. So this is a statistically significant interaction, suggesting that it's not just a lack of statistical strength to find the effect in IFG, it's actually stronger in the temporal lobe than in Broca's area. Okay, I'm going to move on here for purposes of time. So Kernatze and Zurif, if we go back to that original study, they were aware that people with conduction aphasia showed the same agrammatic comprehension profile as people with Broca's aphasia. So they knew this was the case. But what they suggested is, well, if you have damage to Broca's area, that causes a syntactic comprehension deficit because Broca's area implements the syntactic structure building mechanisms. But you might also have a deficit if damage to underlying white matter pathways disconnects the temporal lobe from Broca's area, right? So there's a syntactic mechanism in Broca's area, according to this view, and you can get a deficit in syntactic comprehension either by damaging it directly or disconnecting it from the temporal lobe. So we are processing speech. If you're not able to access those grammatical resources, then perhaps that's why this group of patients, and maybe fluent aphasia in general, might show the agrammatic comprehension profile. And this kind of was borne out to some extent by a paper by Mesalon and colleagues looking at primary and progressive aphasia. Again, this is atrophy and not stroke or damage. So it spares the white matter pathways and only is associated with the degradation of the gray matter of the neurons. And what they find is that comprehension of non-canonical sentence structures is associated with degeneration of frontal and parietal areas, but really not so much temporal lobe, right? So that's somewhat consistent with the Kernatze and Zurif explanation that really the association is with frontal and other areas, but not the temporal lobe. So we decided to look at this. So in our group of subjects, we have the T1 weighted images, which we use to map out their lesions, the damage that's caused by the stroke itself, to the local areas. But we also collected diffusion weighted images, and that allows us to perform probabilistic tractography in our patients. So what we can do essentially is estimate how strong is the connection between two areas, right? Looking at the damage to the tracts that we've estimated using a DTI, right? So we have a measure of connection strength, which is effectively the fiber count, so the number of fibers that were probabilistically tracked in that particular subject, corrected for the distance and volume of the regions that are involved in that connection. So we looked at a subset of 27 left hemispheric cortical regions, including basically the whole lateral temporal lobe, inferior parietal lobe, inferior middle frontal lobe, pre and post central gyri, and lateral and medial visual cortex of the occipital lobe, right? So basically we're doing the same approach that I just described, performing a lesion symptom mapping analysis, but now we're going to use the connectome rather than the damage to the region, right? What's the relationship between behavioral variable and the strength of those connections, right? And if the hypothesis is correct that the fact that we're finding an association between impaired syntactic comprehension and damage to the posterior temporal lobe, then that should show up in the sense that there's a significant disconnection between temporal lobe regions and Broca's area and its environs. Right, so sorry that this figure is a bit busy. These are just taken from a paper that I'm currently working on. But here on the left here, there's 4 different measures that we looked at. So on the left, we have, this is basically a word comprehension measure. On the right is the comprehension of non-canonical sentences. This is without including any covariates because we were closely aligning with the study by Mesalon and colleagues. So we used essentially the same measure as them, comprehension of these non-canonical structures. And you see here, they're both associated with damage to the temporal lobe, right? Below, we have a repetition task, which is associated with damage primarily to the arcuate fasciculus, which makes sense given the literature. And on the right here on the bottom is expressive agrammatism. This is very similar to what I showed you before, right? Damage to inferior middle frontal cortex are strongly associated with agrammatic production. And so what we see here on the left, these are simply ROI analyses that are associated with these maps, but I always like to include either unthresholded or using a weak statistical threshold that's uncorrected in order to illustrate to you that I'm not hiding, any kinds of secret results that might be problematic for my theory, right? So for example, non-canonical sentence comprehension is statistically associated with damage to these 4 ROIs in the middle and posterior temporal lobe, right? And that's corrected for multiple comparisons. But if you look at the voxel-wise maps at a low threshold, you can see there's no additional effects in the frontal lobe. But on the right here, these are the connectome lesion symptom mapping results. So for word comprehension, we see significant disconnections associated with worse performance on word comprehension, basically throughout the temporal lobe and between the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, which makes sense. They're basically performing a task in which they have to process and understand a word, and then they have to select an object that corresponds to that. So these disconnections make sense, and they fit in terms of the pattern of damage that you see. With non-canonical sentence comprehension, we see a similar temporal occipital set of disconnections, but there's a couple extra disconnections associated with deficits on the non-canonical structures. This includes connections between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, as well as the orbital frontal cortex and the visual cortex of the occipital lobe, right? But no disconnections between Broca's area or middle frontal gyrus and the temporal lobe, and no frontal temporal disconnections associated with deficits on the task. So this basically speaks strongly against the hypothesis that the comprehension deficits for syntax that we see in fluent aphasia or middle posterior temporal strokes are not due, they're not caused by disconnection of a grammatical processing center in the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. And if you look at expressive agrammatism, you see something that sort of makes sense, right? Expressive agrammatism is associated with damage to these frontal areas and also disconnection among those frontal areas primarily, as well as a frontal temporal connection, which would make sense for expressive agrammatism, but a different pattern than you see for the non-canonical sentence comprehension. Okay. So another study, this is a preliminary study that is being enacted by my postdoc, Danielle Fahey. And so we were basically just revisiting the concept of syntactic acceptability judgments. And we have a variety of different conditions. It seems like I don't have time to really go into this in too much depth, but we have different conditions, including word order, agreement, and subcategorization. And so these are sort of the basic elements of syntactic structure. And so basically we performed a similar study as I mentioned previously, right? We just give grammatical and ungrammatical sentences to these people with aphasia and ask them to tell us, is the sentence good or bad? And the task we explain is there's somebody who's speaking who may not be fluent speaker of English, and so they might make some mistakes. So tell us, you know, which of their sentences are the mistakes and which ones are not, right? It's auditory presentation. And then basically when we look at our preliminary analysis, this is in only 22 subjects that I have this analysis for. So it's an uncorrected statistical threshold, but we see basically the posterior temporal lobe, in particular the superior temporal sulcus, is the strongest area associated with deficits on this task, which replicates some previous results, and we don't see any effect in Broca's area or the frontal lobe. And if you look at the different conditions separately, basically we see the same kind of pattern. It's just a less robust total result because it's fewer trials and more variability. Okay, so I think that I've established, or I would like to think that I've established strongly that if you look for syntactic comprehension deficits in people with aphasia, it's robustly associated with damage to the posterior temporal lobe and not with damage to Broca's area or the frontal lobe, contrary to the classical view espoused by Karamata and Zuraf and many authors subsequent to them. And it's also not due to disconnection of the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. And so one thing I think I want to just clarify, you know, it is true that people with Broca's aphasia or expressive agrammatism in some studies and some situations do show a pattern that looks like syntactic comprehension deficit. I'm not claiming that that pattern is not there or real, but rather, as we saw before, it could be due to things like the fact that people with Broca's aphasia tend to have damage to the temporal lobe as well. So in part, their deficits may be due to the fact that syntactic comprehension or syntactic structure building mechanisms in the temporal lobe are damaged and may actually cause the deficits that we do see occasionally in people with Broca's aphasia. And all of these studies that I've mentioned here and here on the left are corrected for total lesion volume. As it turns out, people with Broca's aphasia tend to have very large lesions relative to other patient types. And so when you correct for lesion volume, this is a critical aspect of our work, you don't see these associations with damage to Broca's area. Yeah, this study actually was not corrected for lesion volume because it also tends to really reduce your cystical power. But even without including lesion volume, we see it's primarily the temporal lobe. Okay, so again, I think I've established here syntactic comprehension deficits are associated with damage to posterior temporal lobe, not to Broca's area. Now, this, I think, brings us back to the original question that I raised, which is the classical model is great, but not very linguistically sophisticated. And we do believe that the syntactic structure building mechanisms that humans have that enable their fundamental creativity, that they're not tied to a particular modality of expression or comprehension, right? These are supposed to be central, abstract, underlying systems. So it does seem now a bit unsatisfying to say, well, you've got a production grammar in the frontal lobe and a comprehension grammar in the temporal lobe. And if I hope I was clear in explaining our theoretical model, right? What we think is that the hierarchical structure is in the temporal lobe, and that these linearization procedures that are necessary for externalization, those are in the frontal lobe. So that raises the question, shouldn't we see production deficits also following from damage to the posterior temporal lobe, right? If this is truly a system that underlies hierarchical structure building, you should see production deficits. And in fact, Wernicke actually originally observed, aside from his deficient comprehension, the patient with a fluent aphasia has aphasic manifestations in speaking because of the absence of the corrective function. So this is with respect to phonological and lexical selection deficits, but his idea was you do see parallel deficits in fluent aphasia, right? You do see comprehension deficits and production deficits that he thought were caused by the fact that you don't have this corrective mechanism. So the question now that I'd like to ask is that also the case for fluent aphasia damage to the posterior temporal lobe, right? Are there syntactic production deficits that follow from damage to roughly Wernicke's area, right? And it turns out there's not just this syndrome called agrammatism, there's also the syndrome called paragramatism. And this was first defined by Kleist, a neurologist in the early 20th century. And what he said that in paragramatism, the ability to create word orders is not abolished, but phrases and sentences are often wrongly chosen and thereby amalgamate and contaminate each other. Phrases and sentence constructions are not completed. The spoken expression is not simplified overall, instead also conditioned by a strong overproduction of word sequences. It swells to confuse sentence monsters. So the idea here was that these people are fluent, but they will have problems with the structure of their sentences. And this is with respect to the syntactic structure of their utterances. There may be the presence of interesting and complex structures, but that they'll make a lot of errors and they may lack this corrective mechanism that Wernicke described, that they're unable to notice that they're making grammatical errors due to the underlying abstract system. So we basically decided to look for the Lesion correlates of agrammatism and paragrammatism. As I've mentioned numerous times already, agrammatism is strongly associated with damage to the frontal lobe and Broca's area, although not perfectly always. There's some complications with that. But we don't, previous to our study, there was no comprehensive investigation of paragrammatism. So we wanted to first establish, is it the case that paragrammatism is associated with damage to the posterior temporal lobe? So we looked at I've got two large groups of subjects here. One is a very large set of 218, for which we have measures of comprehension, which I'll describe in a minute. And we had 53 subjects that we're able to look at for these perceptual ratings of agrammatism and paragrammatism. So I'll describe that part first. What we did is we started off with 100 people with posterior aphasia, and they told the story of Cinderella in their own words. And we basically had a set of raters that looked at each patient's production and categorized them as agrammatic, paragrammatic, or no grammatical deficit. And so we ended up with 53, 47 subjects we could not categorize for a variety of issues, one of which was simply that subjects might not have produced much of anything at all, which could have been for a variety of reasons, not just their aphasia, but also their mood and the particular task, or severe distortions caused by apraxia, which is a difficulty in the articulation of speech, or some other technical issue. So we ended up with 53. And so if we look at the people that we categorized as paragrammatic, these are just a few examples of the grammatical errors that we noticed. And my postdoc, Danielle Fahey, is actually working on a much more comprehensive evaluation of the utterance types that constitute paragrammatism. But as a few examples, three other sister, this is an agreement error, right? Three is a plural quantifier in English, which requires agreement on a plural noun. He had to do all the works. Works being a mass noun that shouldn't take the plural s. Wanted to make a trick her. This is an interesting example here. Wanted to make a trick. You can use trick as a noun, but then it's sort of glommed on as a verb with the object her, right? Wanted to make a trick her. So we'll call it fusion error. She goed back to the boy. This is an over-regularization error, commonly seen in children. One stepfather and a stepchildren, right? So we've got a single indefinite determiner, and stepchildren, a plural noun. The sum happened to them, right? This is, again, sort of like an absence of a noun phrase here, or like the double use of these two determiners, which would normally be ungrammatical. So if we look at the Lesion correlates, again, to make a long story short, I'm happy to answer more questions about this. But basically, we find agrammatism associated with frontal damage, as I've explained frequently, and paragrammatism damage to the posterior temporal lobe, inferior parietal lobe, right, as we would expect given the hypothesis. And this holds even if we incorporate a speech rate as a covariate. People with agrammatism tend to not produce as much speech. People with paragrammatism, actually, they produce more speech than patients that don't have a grammatical production deficit. So the question could be like, is it simply speaking faster associated with temporal damage, speaking slower associated with frontal damage? And if we find that the effect holds regardless when incorporating speech rate as a covariate. Let's see, I'm going to skip to this slide here. So now the question is grammatical parallelism. Is it the case that people with paragrammatism also tend to have syntactic comprehension deficits, right? The original idea from Karamazov and Zurif was overarching agrammatism. People with expressive agrammatism tend to have syntactic comprehension deficits. Now we're asking the other question, right? The flip side of that question. Do people with paragrammatism tend to have syntactic comprehension deficits? So this now is using the larger set of subjects that I mentioned in 218, where we have measures of word recognition, where the subject is given a prefix like show me the, and then there's either cup or square, etc., and they have to point out the correct object. So solving the task only requires lexical perception. And then we also have the sequential commands test, which asks the subjects to point with the pen to the book, or point to the pen, point with the pen to the book, or point to the pen with the book, point to the comb with the pen, etc. There's some less complex and more complex commands, but you can see here to overall perform accurately, you're going to have to parse the structure correctly, right? You're going to have to associate the correct prepositions with the correct objects in order to solve that task. So that requires syntax. So what we do essentially is we take their subjects and their scores on sequential commands and incorporate the auditory word recognition score as a covariate. So we're looking at performance of and beyond the ability to perceive a lexical item, right? To parse the structure and perform the task. So what we find on that measure is if we look at people with agrammatism, there's a very small and non-significant difference in syntactic comprehension performance between people who are agrammatic or not. So people who are agrammatic tend to perform a little worse than people who are not agrammatic, although it's not significant, and there's very small evidence to suggest that that's the case. And critically, this is without incorporating lesion volume. As I mentioned before, these patients tend to have very large lesions, so I'll return to that. By contrast, people that are paragrammatic perform significantly worse on this measure relative to those that are not paragrammatic, right? And that is significant, and there's some moderate to strong evidence in favor of that conclusion. So now the problem, of course, is lesion volume. People with agrammatic Broca's aphasia have lesions almost twice the size of people with paragrammatism. So if you incorporate lesion volume as a covariate, what you find is there's no relationship between agrammatism and syntactic comprehension deficits, but there is a robust relationship between paragrammatism and syntactic comprehension deficits. That suggests that some of the previous results we've seen in the literature where people with Broca's aphasia have that agrammatic profile may simply be due to the fact that they have a large lesion that likely impinges on the temporal lobe, perhaps damaging some of these syntactic resources. And so again, if we do the lesion symptom mapping analysis, Here with agrammatism and paragrammatism, these are the set of 53 subjects, and we see that they're associated with their distinct lesion correlates, which I showed you before. And then we find that the syntactic comprehension, again, this particular measure, which is another measure that we derived, is associated with damage to middle posterior temporal lobe and the posterior insula, but no frontal cortex. And then these are the uncorrected, actually the unthresholded maps, as I mentioned before. Well, you can see, right, agrammatism, paragrammatism, and our syntactic comprehension measure is more strongly associated with temporal lobe than frontal, although there is some in the precentral gyrus, which I believe has to do with phonological working memory. You can see, if you look at the sequential commands test on its own, without using auditory word comprehension as a covariate, it's entirely temporal lobe and insula with no frontal involvement, right? So take that for what it's worth. So now what we do is we correlate damage to the agrammatism ROI, right? So we use this set of regions and we say, okay, people with damage here, how is percent damage to that area associated with syntactic comprehension, right? How much does damage to the agrammatism ROI predict syntactic comprehension deficits? And the answer is, to some extent, it does, when not incorporating lesion volume as a covariate. There's a much stronger relationship with damage to the paragrammatism ROI and these syntactic comprehension deficits, right? There's much stronger evidence for that. And then when we incorporate lesion volume, again, we get no relationship between damage to the agrammatism ROI, which again is Broca's area and the posterior middle frontal gyrus. And then we get a very robust relationship between damage to the paragrammatism ROI and syntactic comprehension deficits, right? So the conclusion here, I hate to use the term, but it seems like something like overarching paragrammatism is a more accurate description of the reality than overarching agrammatism, right? Damage to the posterior temporal lobe, that produces deficits in hierarchical syntax. And I think that if you dive into paragrammatism further, which is something I elided earlier, that you can explain a lot of paragrammatic speech errors through deficits in a hierarchical structure mechanism. So for example, agreement errors, that's a plausible explanation that they struggle with agreement because they lack the guiding hierarchical structure to compute the appropriate relation. And so essentially, they have difficulties ascertaining the well-formedness of their own utterances as well as those of others, right? Which explains why the association of acceptability judgment deficits correlates with damage to the same areas as found in paragrammatism, right? And this is consistent with some of Wernicke's original ideas. As I mentioned before, he suggested a parallelism of deficits between production and comprehension due to posterior temporal lobe damage because of the lack of a corrective mechanism that is unable to appropriately guide the speech output, even though there's still plenty of speech output because there's an intact frontal system that contains, you know, in his terms, articulatory word memories, what we can think of as sequences of morphological and phonological elements that allow for fluent streams of linear elements, but not guided by that hierarchical structure, which then of course there'll be errors and then the patient would be unable to catch them without that guidance. Okay, so this basically sums it up. You know, we think this is consistent with the model that we proposed and also Wernicke's original ideas. And so now I'd just like to thank all of my collaborators for working on this project. In particular, recently, Danielle Fahey, who's done a lot of work in our lab, diving into paragrammatism and the acceptability judgments, our funding sources, including the NIH, and appreciate very much you listening. And I look forward to your questions, and debate would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William. It was really quite wonderful to see how you answered all these old questions with new methodology, and I'm sure the audience has tons of questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat now or just speak up. Maybe we can start with Stan. Stan, you had a question, right? Would you like to ask yourself?
Yes. Hi, William. Thank you for the talk. I had a question about your DTI data, and in particular your statement that the frontal to temporal connections were definitely not important. for this process. But if I remember correctly, you showed no effect or the absence of an effect. And I was wondering if that warrants such a strong statement.
No, that's a fair point. And actually, you know, if I had to be completely honest, I do think that working memory is a critical component. And I have, in previous publications of my own, claimed that Broca's area is often engaged in these comprehension processes because it contributes this working memory resource, whether that's specialized for syntactic representations, which I believe it is, or via some phonological working memory mechanism, right? So non-canonical sentence structures, you know, we would expect those to rely on those kinds of resources. And so very well, you know, disruption to that connection or even damage to Broca's area might impair that process to some extent. So I think that explains, you know, some of the associations we've seen in the past between Broca's aphasia and deficits in comprehension. But the difference is, the question is, what is the primary driving factor? And so the hypothesis of Keramata and Zuref and Meslom et al. Is very clear. They claim that the syntactic mechanisms are in the frontal lobe, and that the comprehension deficits that you see, at least in terms of Meslom's hypothesis, for those specific structures, we use the exact same ones, right? The deficit is not due to the cortical dysfunction of the temporal lobe, but rather the white matter damage that disconnects it, right? That's, for them, that is the entire explanation for the pattern of deficits that you see. So if that were true, then I would hope to see at least some effects of that, you know, association. So I agree with you. These are important connections. And I do think when you perform functional neuroimaging studies, as many of you at this institute have performed, you routinely see activation in Broca's area. And I know there's also studies that look at, you know, cortical stimulation of the arcuate fasciculus and things, or white matter stimulation of arcuate fasciculus, and show that it has some effects. And so I wouldn't say that there's no role there, right? But if it were the fundamental underlying explanation, then you would hope to see something show up, right? Which is not what we see. And then importantly, we do see those disconnections in repetition deficits, right? So we found very robust, significant disconnections of frontal temporal connections for repetition deficits, which suggests that we're not missing something like our analysis or probabilistic tractography is unable to, you know, capture those disconnections. Like, we see them for other factors. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah,
it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Carol, maybe I just jump in for a clarification. Well, so again, thank you very much, and I think there was a very brilliant talk from the clinical side. I have more of a clarification from you. It's like, what would be the behavioral overlap, also linguistically describable, between agrammatism and paragramatism? What would they share? Let's go back to frankly talking about syntax. So I mean, I would imagine in one case we can talk about hierarchy, in the other case hierarchy is preserved or completely destroyed. So that would be probably at descriptive level some overlapping between these two phenomena. And related to that, how you split then paragrammatic patients from agrammatic ones to occur, if it's really like telegraphic versus some type of different fluency. But biggest interest is to say what's the overlap between them.
That's an important question. And to some extent, as I mentioned, you know, because people with Broca's aphasia tend to have large lesions that impinge on the temporal lobe, if they're affecting those syntactic mechanisms, then can we say they're purely agrammatic, right? And actually in our sample, we did identify 4 people that we categorized as both agrammatic and paragrammatic. But this is a difficult question, and this is something that's at the forefront of what we're working on, because we used Kleist's sort of clinical definition, which is that underlying agrammatism is a tendency to omit and simplify or reduce structure. And that in paragrammatism, it's not an overall tendency to omit, but rather more of a stochastic error process, that there's grammatical errors which could be caused either by omission or the presence of additional elements. And that's a critical distinction, because if you look at a given utterance from a paragrammatic patient, it may be an omission that causes the error. For example, some of the stuff that we've looked at, they may omit, for example, a noun phrase complement, like an entire phrase, right? They have a verb that's transitive and the noun phrase is omitted, right? So you could say, well, that should be agrammatic, right? That's an omission. But, again, we're sort of hearkening back to Kleist's definition, right? We're thinking about the underlying generator of those errors, which is stochastic and could be causing either omissions or presence of things. And there are ways to distinguish those. So with agrammatism, for example, it's rare to omit a noun complement. They may omit functional elements, for example, like a determiner in the noun phrase, but it's rare that they would say, the boy kicked or, the man killed with omitting the noun phrase, or at least they would not omit the noun, right? Whereas the Paragramatism, that's actually not too uncommon to see the content words themselves omitted that are sort of core to the basic thematic relations of the sentence. So I don't know if I'm answering your question fully. It's a really deep, long conversation to have, but it needs to be ironed out. And I do think there needs to be a detailed explanation for the syntactic mechanisms that are impaired and how those lead to the specific pattern of deficits that we see in Paragrammatism.
Exactly, because I think as a suggestion, you might be really able, moving from linguistics, to give much more symptom-oriented descriptions of the different patients. I think it's might be very hard to disentangle each and every patient terms, but I think a linguistic diagnostics would be really helpful for us. And I think also because these points, also because these points I'm sorry to
interrupt. Go ahead.
No, just to say, because the points you're putting in the correlations are people that might be really described in terms of much fine-grained linguistic.
And we are obliged to provide that detailed connection. This is something that's actually funny. My roommate for a while was Shota Moma, who's a brilliant psycholinguist studying production. He did his PhD at the University of Maryland, and it's a very linguistically theoretic department. And I remember talking to him about this work, and I said, I'm excited about Paragramatism, right? Some evidence that you see these grammatical deficits with, posterior temporal damage. It's the hierarchical structure, right? That's where it is. It's in the temporal lobe. And he's like, well, why would a deficit in hierarchical syntax cause Paragramatism? And I was like, oh my God, that's really the basic and obvious question that we really have to answer in detail. So I agree.
Right.
Maybe I can jump. Yes. Maybe I can jump in here. Hi. Thanks, Owen, for this, interesting view on sort of aphasia. I have been working on that for a long time. So I think that was interesting to bring the paragrammatic, issues in here. I think we do agree on, that the inferior frontal gyrus and the temporal lobe do this work together. And there is sort of, this fiber track linking those two regions. And, we have shown, in the children's data that this is really important and that this can sort of the strength of it can predict the performance. I think what we are discussing rather, and this is also what Emiliano, tried to get at is, where is the hierarchy building?
Yes.
Done. We think I think, it's inferior frontally, and you think it's the temporal cortex. And I was wondering whether the examples you gave from the aphasics, where you say, well, they don't do agreement, whether that's a good indicator for saying, well, they cannot do sort of hierarchy building. So I was wondering whether there is more strong data than this kind of, data.
So is there, are you suggesting that agreement may not?
Well, this is what you said, they make an error, the paragrammatics make an error in agreement. And from this, you conclude that they are not able to do sort of kind of hierarchy building.
So, I think, so in general, I guess there's two observations about Paragrammatism that make me believe there's a hierarchical issue. One is simply the fact that they seem to be unaware of the grammatical errors that they're producing. And so going back again to Wernicke's original idea, the question is, why not? If you compare that with agrammatics, they tend to be keenly aware. As the patient that I mentioned, Carl, right, he says, small words, no pictures, cat's fine, but these little words, and he even like points them out, like, I don't even know what to do with these little words. And there's often a sense of the reduced fluency in part due to a keen awareness that there's some problem with the grammatical form that they're expressing, right? Whereas the paragrammatics, they actually are more fluent than people without a grammatical deficit, and they don't seem to correct these errors or notice them, which suggests, right, I think a straightforward explanation for why they don't correct the errors is that there's no corrective mechanism, and that corrective mechanism would be their internal ability to process the structure of what they themselves are producing. So I think that that fact motivates that explanation of hierarchical structure. Now, the agreement is an interesting case, and I do think it bears worth thinking about in detail. So, with agreement, for example, in Paragramatism, it's not necessarily the absence of morphosyntactic inflections like number or, like a subject-verb agreement or number of things like that. It's not the absence of the inflections. It's not necessarily the ability to attach the affix onto the noun or the verb or whatever it is, but it's the appropriate inflection, right?
Make one point. I think, I have seen a lot of, patients, with sort of maybe Paragrammatism, or at least with Wernicke's characteristics. I think it really depends on where you, for example, also in the production, where you cut sort of out the sort of word or sequence that you want to look at. Because what they do, and you know that very well, they have parts where they are doing this syntactically correct, but then they kind of switch into another construction. Yeah. I mean, if that, if you take that as showing that they are sort of not good in hierarchy building, I could also argue they are good in local hierarchy building, but then they somehow, it shifts away and, they go into another construction. So it seems as if they do have constructions, but they are not connecting them the right way. What do you think about this?
Well, I think you make a really essential point, which is something that has also bothered me in the sense that these patients, I cherry-picked a few examples, but if you look at their totality of production, there are many grammatical expressions. Obviously, there's the presence of complex structures in their output. It's not word salad, for example, right? They're not randomly scrambling things around. And so what I would say is, I guess we don't have a fully fledged theory of the externalization process incorporating the morphosyntax, the word order. And what I think is going on, what I think is happening in the frontal areas, in particular in the pars triangularis, pars brachularis, is that there really is something like the people that are not linguistically sophisticated and think there's n-grams, right? They think there's like just a stored repository of probabilistic sequences of elements, and that may in fact be something that the frontal cortex is executing. And then there's the question of, what does the speech output of a system that only has these probabilistic sequential elements look like? And I don't know if we've established that, but my guess is it might look fairly normal in a lot of circumstances because there are high probabilistic sequences of elements. But then what you see, or you start to see, are breakdowns in terms of the relations that are non-local or non-sequential elements, which is why I brought up the agreement, right, as an example. And that's, if you look at these artificial neural networks, for example, some of Tal Linsen's work, right, it looks like they learn grammar, but then if you test them on certain cases, for example, agreement, they might fail at that, indicating that they maybe haven't learned the hierarchical structure, even though they may generate a lot of coherent looking text. So I take your question as extremely important, and I think we would have to ask the question, like, what does grammar look like without hierarchical syntax, right? What should we expect the production ability to look like? And I agree with you, it's a bit suspicious that they can be so good. It's not their complete disorder. And so that does need to be worked out in detail, I think.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just add a very naive question to that. The hierarchical deficit that you say you find in the temporal lobe, does it have to be the computational parts of the hierarchical processing, or can that also, considering that the temporal lobe is also well known for memory, can that also be other aspects of, like, as you said, learning and like knowledge about hierarchy?
So you're contrasting two possible theories of the function of this area. One is it doing merge or whatever the computational mechanisms are for building structure versus, for example, maybe some stored learned constructions, but not necessarily the computational mechanism underlying that. Is that fair?
Yes, I was wondering if there's more to it than just the computational process that we in Leipzig may find more in the frontal areas. And so I'm wondering if there's another aspect to it that you now find.
You say another aspect, or
another aspect that may point into another direction of like maybe hierarchical knowledge. So if you don't have the hierarchical knowledge anymore that may be stored in the temporal lobe, then you also cannot do the computations in other areas of the brain.
Right. So I mean, in the paper that I published with Greg Hickok, right, we were claiming that the sort of fuzzy claim that we made is that stored hierarchical constructions are basically in the posterior temporal lobe. And then we were a bit agnostic about how the brain implements the hierarchical computation itself. And the reason for that is that, it was pretty heavily influenced by Randy Galstol's work and other just sort of points that it's difficult to understand how a computation is implemented in brain tissue. It could be that there's a particular area that is sort of like housing that in a neural network. It could be a subtler level of organization. It could be implicitly embedded in the connections, or intracellular in some other part of the brain, or based on the oscillatory dynamics. We chose to be agnostic about that because we felt uncertain about that level of description. So we started by saying, look, the hierarchical structures are stored in the temporal lobe. And that also helps us explain why we see the overlap of lexical and syntactic processing in all of these regions, but also in the temporal lobe, right? Is that constructions include projections of lexical items, or basically lemmas as well. So so I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that there are possibilities, right? So for example, there could be a model by which, Broca's area and the arcufasciculus implement a hierarchical computation, and they generate structures, right, in development that are stored in the temporal lobe. And then that is like a repository of knowledge that you use when damaged. Is difficult to relearn them because you've become an adult, right? But maybe there's still the computation there. But I would say, I guess one of my main points that I would be interested in hearing all of your feedback on is, if it is true that Broca's area and the arcufasciculus, to whatever model I think you're using, are really implementing core hierarchical computations, then I think you would expect damage to those systems to produce some deficits. And then the question is, what kinds of deficits would you expect that to cause? If you destroy merge, right, what should be the behavioral profile of the patient? I guess that's a question for you guys. It's not fair for the speaker to ask a question, but I have this rare opportunity to speak with all of you, and I am greatly appreciative. So I'm curious what you would say.
Yeah, I guess we can have a long discussion about that. It's obviously very interesting to all of us. Thank you very much. Matteo, do you still want to ask your question?
Yes, I wanted to ask a question regarding, which also links a bit to where we arrived with the discussion now, which is whether we might observe a role of both the inferior frontal gyrus and the temporal lobe once we not only look at, for example, a single index, which is the behavioral performance, but also at the timing. So, for example, we have models that say we have a first step of automatic analysis and a late control process. And also I remember from many of your works that the activation in the temporal lobe posterior was very much task related, or like this kind of block effect that you showed in your data. So I was wondering whether, for example, a patient with a lesion, assuming that the left AVG does this automatic process, but has an posterior temporal lobe, might not show a deficit because it can recruit some, let's say, second, late syntactic process to compensate for that, to give, for example, a correct answer. Or in other words, if you want, my question is whether performing the tests and how basically you quantify syntactic processing with the patients, recruits the same automatic processes during naturalistic comprehension, or whether that the ability to for patients to give a correct answer might rely on second level processes that are task related.
Mm-hmm. So I have to think about your question for a bit, but it does seem that that could be a possible explanation. I'd have to think about it in more detail. I mean, one thing I think we all agree upon is you can, and many of the neuroimaging studies produced in your lab, I mean, will show during a syntactic processing and comprehension, you get very robust activation in Broca's area. That is undeniable, right? And every study that I performed essentially shows that. You guys have been, leading the way and showing that. So the question is, what is happening during that process, right? And not even, I work with Matchin Hickok, and he's fond of saying, well, these complicated structures, these multiply embedded or object relatives, but you could do very, Emiliano's work, right? I mean, you've got 2-word phrases or 3-word phrases will activate Broca's area robustly. So the question, I think, what is causing that activation? And I do think that probably in healthy subjects and online processing, and you think of like demanding processing environments, that here's my story about what happens, right? That in the posterior temporal lobe, those are activated early. The lexical items and the associated structures are activated, which form a construction of some kind, but that Broca's area is really heavily involved in predicting upcoming elements and producing some kind of top-down pre-activation in the temporal lobe, which is a greatly facilitating effect, which is very useful, and we may use it constantly, in everyday comprehension. And so I think that that's the sort of dichotomy that I'm thinking. I don't know how that, I know that doesn't quite particularly align with what you're saying, but it does suggest that these mechanisms are important and in some sense are involved in the computation or the building of syntactic structure, but that they're not strictly necessary for the building of the structure. I think that's the difference in our sort of group's positions, right? Is that I think we both would agree they're engaged during syntactic structure building in healthy subjects, but are those mechanisms strictly necessary for building a structure to getting to the finish line, even if you get to the finish line slowly, right? So there's some research showing that people with damage to Broca's area, their sentence comprehension impairments improve when you slow the rate of presentation down. You slow the rate of presentation, they tend to catch up and do close to the control subjects. So I think that's somewhat consistent with what I'm describing. But I agree with you, there could be some other explanation that I need to, again, think about in more depth, but perhaps the patients that I'm looking at, are able to rely on a sort of alternative mechanism, which is a fail-safe, right? Which will get you the correct answer, but is not necessarily the primary computation.
Yeah, I mean, without going to domain general mechanisms, even remaining within syntactic processing, I mean, going to the ERP literature, for example, we see ELAN and P600. And I was thinking if a patient has a deficit in the ELAN stage, in the early automatic structure building, but has an intact late repairing reanalysis process, would be able to, for example, give you a correct answer, maybe as you were saying, slower. So maybe my question was really if you, for example, would put damage to the posterior temporal lobe as an ELAN or as a P600 deficit, and the same for the left IFG.
Well, this has been done, right? There was, there's a study that someone, I think from related to your lab, right? Was it Sonia Coates, or I can't remember who did it, but right, they looked at people with damage to Broca's area. I think they were trying to look for patients with selective lesions that weren't very large, right? What they showed is that the patients, correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, intact ELAN, but no P600, right? It was for word order violations. They showed I can't remember the details, but it seemed to me that the results were suggesting that the early automatic processing for basic structure was intact, but that things that require agreement, the long distance computation, were impaired or slowed with damage to Broca's area, which seemed to me, I think, a bit the converse of what you're saying, right? The automatic structure building seemed intact, but the additional mechanisms were impaired, if I recall correctly.
Because I remember the opposite part, and that's why I was asking, because I was really interested in seeing whether this posterior temporal lobe is...
I'm trying to find the paper.
Yes, I mean, it was the opposite. I'm happy to send you the paper again.
Okay.
I mean, we did this together with Sonja Kotz, and we exactly, you know, had patients with lesions in the temporal cortex and the inferior frontal cortex.
Okay.
But, you know, as you pointed out, you know, with respect to the Broca's patients, the lesions were pretty large in the inferior frontal cortex. And so in order to really raise out the early left anterior negativity, there was subcortical involvement as well. So, but I think it's an interesting point that Matteo is bringing up here, you know, looking again at, you know, the timing and, you know, what the, you know, aphasic patients can do.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you for the answer.
Of course.
Okay, and there is another question from someone on YouTube. Judita, I'm just going to read it. So she wrote, I was wondering if you have an intuition on how other atypical linguistic profiles that show production comprehension asymmetries, which are not necessarily linked to brain lesions, for example, developmental language disorders, would be described in your model.
So specifically, I guess with respect to SLI or DLD, developmental language disorder, I mean, I'm not a complete expert on this syndrome, but my understanding of it, there's some discussion, right, that there's some range of deficits that one could see in SLI or DLD that have to do more often with production and often in terms of sequencing at multiple levels of linguistic representation, phonological and morphological, but that they seem to have pretty good comprehension, and that I know there was some initial controversy about SLI, whether it was like a fundamental grammatical thing or a broader sequencing thing. And I thought the evidence finally came down on it being more of a sequencing thing. But, you know, we do know that SLI and DLD are associated with some changes in the brain organization in the frontal cortex and basal ganglia. And so to me, that would suggest that what's happening in development. So, you know, I'm working on a sort of paper that relates to the development, right? Like the system that I'm describing, the adult system, right? The question is now, how does that emerge through development? And the idea that I have is that basically there's an innate, you know, syntactic system that's associated with the temporal lobe that generates complex expressions that are interpreted in other parts of the temporal lobe and the angular gyrus in terms of their semantic interpretation. And then what happens in development of language development is essentially you have to learn how to externalize those hierarchical expressions, right? This is inspired by Berwick and Chomsky, right? The idea is that what you're learning are essentially the sensory motor exponents, which include things like word order and morphosyntactic features, et cetera. And so you have to harness this pre-existing frontal tissue, which other evidence suggests is involved in sequencing and motor behavior. And you're sort of doing using Dehen's terms, the neuronal recycling, right? You're co-opting that information to be specialized for processing linguistic representations, right? You're sort of taking a piece of the prefrontal cortex and you're saying, you are going to be, you know, taking that hierarchical structure and determining the order of elements that I need to produce. And then I think that fits actually quite nicely with a lot of the data that your lab has produced in terms of looking at the strength of the arcuovesiculus and how that changes over development and correlates with language abilities. And I think there's a lot of other data that bear on that question as well. But in terms of the questionnaire specific comment, right, I think something like developmental language disorder would be some difficulty in that process akin to what Dehen describes for dyslexia, right? For Dehen, dyslexia in part is you have to do this neural retuning of the visual word form area, right? You have to take an area that's not meant to do orthography and you have to twist and turn it to be specialized for words. And that's difficult. And the opacity of the language can influence that process and result in dyslexia because this is a difficult harnessing of tissue and reinterpretation of it. So I would say that likewise, something like SLI would be a similar disorder where you're harnessing the frontal cortex to be specialized for linguistic representations, which is difficult, right? And then problems with that system can then result in something that looks like SLI or DLD. I think that's the best answer I can give to the question, unless there's a follow-up, but I'd be curious to hear more if there's other kinds of disorders that people are thinking about.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Jana, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just maybe that many people, exactly. Oh, Jixing just raised her hand, but I really wanted to mention her because I think Will made very nice points about the idea of engrams in the inferior frontal gyrus, for example. So more predictability, predictive processing, and including maybe cognitive abilities that are also beyond language. So William, do you think there will be a benefit? How would you benefit to include also, all these analysis on naturalistic corpora that I've been doing right now? I mean, Jixing is now the representative of that world. So would this kind of analysis help you with your aphasia models? So trying to go further on the mechanistic level, because I think it's very nice what you said about this predictive abilities that inferior frontal gyrus might probably have. We're working on, in that sense, like disturbing an area and that see whether it's more of a bottom-up or top-down processing. But at the same time, you see from Hickok analysis around thinking about the Nelson paper, the PNS paper, or several works also Jixing that's been putting forward. If thinking about top-down and bottom-up processing would help you further with your models on aphasia.
Well, definitely. I mean, I would love to see some of these models adapted for production, and then we can lesion them, right, and see are there separable components that when lesion produce the deficits that we're interested in.
Okay.
So that's one thing. I mean, I was working with John Hale a little bit to get a project off the ground, which is still the beginning stages, but we were actually going to use samples of these naturalistic productions of people with aphasia, right, telling the Cinderella story, and then have train the artificial neural network to learn essentially the grammars that these patients have, right? So, typically you train the model on a corpus of healthy individuals, right? It's picking up the healthy grammar, but the idea was we can train it on agrammatism and paragramatism, and then we can, do Tal Linsen's trick, right? Kind of probe these models and see what do they know, right? What do they not know? Do the models seem to know hierarchical syntax, or they seem to have a deficit in that? That's one thing that I was thinking could be useful. Yeah.
What I'm just figuring out, I think, and then I'm sorry for talking about much, but there are so many inspiring points in this talk, is that, first lecture psycholinguistics, you learn that production is a looking ahead process. Spoonerisms are just a classical example in that sense. So how hard it is to look at naturalistic production data if anything is happening before you're actually spelling out what you want to say. And that's, I think, it's a big challenge for all of us in the future, because talking about production is probably looking at the consequences of something that has been happening before. While we are pretty sure that we're talking about online comprehension, people don't know what's going to happen in the next 3 words, but probably you're speaking up. You make an
excellent point. And if we had, it would be better to have a fully fledged model of the production process, like implementing.
So I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Implementing Leyfeld's model, for example, or enriching such a model to incorporate these different aspects of syntax that I've been describing, and sort of running with Berwick and Chomsky's ideas, right? If there's an initial stage of calculating the hierarchical structure, and then there's stages of linearization and lexical insertion and the lower levels of phonetic extension. Like if you had a model of that, then you could model the time course and do like the Nelson paper in production. But that's really hard, right? As you said, with production, it's sort of more mysterious, the order in which these operations occur, whereas in comprehension, you're given elements externally.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, wrong. No, it's not that. Thank you. Brilliant answer, William. Thank you. And I'll shut up now. I'll give it to Jixing, probably. Caro, if she had a question as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering. So you can also compare comprehension, naturalistic comprehension of the patients with like the normal subject. Have you considered?
So I had like a bunch of ideas when I first got it started, and I was overwhelmed. So I remember emailing with John and saying like, oh, well, we're going to do your stuff. We're just going to put the patients in the scanner and we're going to do the thing, right? And it'll be great. And then I was swamped and like doing other things. And then I've been impressed that we got the analysis of production, using the artificial neural networks off the ground at all. But yes, that would be something we could do, right? We could scan these people in fMRI and do the exact same, just take the procedure essentially out of the box and just do it in the patients. It wouldn't be that hard to do. I think what we would need is a large enough sample to get the lesion distributions correct, and then have some hypotheses and figure out what we're really going to learn. It would be interesting, for example, if patients with damage to the posterior temporal lobe, like, for example, do they not show the syntactic processing effects in the frontal lobe, right? Is there a dependency in some way, right? Is it asymmetric, right? If you have damage to the frontal lobe, do you show intact syntactic activation profiles in the temporal lobe? But then if you have damage to the temporal lobe, it doesn't show up in the frontal lobe, right? Which would suggest there's some asymmetrical dependency, for example. Or these, there's probably a lot of things one could do, but I agree, it would be fun. And not too hard to start, at least, doing.
Yeah, because like I think there are two aspects of like a model. So there's a grammar, there's like a parsing strategy. So yeah, I'm not sure like whether Paragramatism can be thinking of like problem with parsing, not actually the grammar.
Yeah.
And the frontal regions can like be actually the problem with grammar. Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. I think that what I would still want to know is if you destroy the grammar, what does the language performance of a subject look like? Now, this is a problem because, in linguistic theory, right? I remember I went to CUNY in 2012, and Chomsky gave a keynote lecture, and his keynote lecture was pretty much, you guys just like stop doing psycholinguistics. Like, language performance is way too complicated. You got to work on competence. It's too hard. It's too messy to understand how people perform language. Now, John Hale's work is, I think, really useful in trying to, in a very informed way, to break down that distinction. But, so it's hard to ask the question, right? Well, then what does performance look like when grammar is damaged? But I would like to think that you would see some kind of deficits, right? That you would see something. Now the question is what that is, right? And then we'd have to formulate that hypothesis and be clear about it.
Okay, thank you all so much. I think we could ask you so many more questions and be here for another hour or so.
Very, very synergistic group. I mean, we all know each other's work very well. It's very pleasing to talk to you guys. So
absolutely. And I hope we can continue the conversation maybe later on in our social gathering.
Yes.
And so with that, I would really like to thank you from all of us and from all the attendees as well for joining us here today and for having such a stimulating discussion after the talk as well. And so to everyone now, to all the attendees as well, we're going to have a poster session that's supposed to start in a minute, but I would say we all give each other like 10 minutes of a break and we'll start the poster session in 10 minutes on Gather Town.
Okay. William, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was my pleasure.